So let's review the process of learning and talk about the relationship of attention, engagement, and memory. So engagement is really an interaction of three elements: attention, sensory memory or perception, and work in memory. Now let's look at that more closely. So we drew a diagram that looks something like this, and this is that process of taking in information through our senses and then processing that information and then storing that information in long-term memory. It has 5 steps. We're going to look at phase 1 and phase 2, primarily concentrating on phase 1, because phase 1, without phase 1, you never get to phase 2. So let's look at this really closely. Let's start right here with number 1. Number 1 is sensory memory, and sensory memory is our ability to take in incoming information. It's auditory, it's kinesthetic, it's visual, it's emotional. That is sensory memory. It's sensory input that we're taking in, the perceptions, if you will, that we absorbed from our physical environment. Now go ahead and tap that back portion of your brain, that back portion of your head. That is where that sensory input information goes. Now I'm oversimplifying the process, but conceptually what happens is information is perceived. The reticular activating system, or the RAS system, filters that incoming information and prioritizes. It says, okay, this is what's important and this is what is not important. And that is essentially what attention is. Say it with me, say attention. Attention is the mousetrap of learning, which means that attention is that portion of the brain that prioritizes what is important. And without attention, no comprehension takes place. So attention is that ability to focus on discrete information while we ignore the other information that our brain has said is less important or is less of a priority. The law is attention is the mousetrap of learning, and it means that attention determines what we process and therefore what we encode into memory. If there's no attention, there can't be any processing or encoding, which is why we say no attention, no comprehension. So, attention or sensory information is filtered and focused in attention. Once that information is filtered and focused, it lands right here in what we call working memory. Now, working memory is the processing center of the brain, and I like to think of working memory like a frying pan. And just like a frying pan is where we cook up a meal or cook up food, working memory is the place where we cook up information or cook up memories. And just like a frying pan, it's limited. It can only hold so much information. So what happens is incoming information comes in through the attention filter, it prioritizes, it says, oh, this is important, and all of that information lands in working memory. And working memory does two things that are really important. First of all, it takes that information incoming from attention, but it also goes to our memory banks, our storage banks right here. And it says, oh, okay, what do I have related to this information? And it pulls up those memory files. That schema, what we call it in cognition. It pulls up that information, and all of that information, those old storage files or those related storage files, plus the information that we're filtering into from attention, land in working memory. And this is where we find meaning. We use our stored information and that new incoming information to go, what is this? What does it mean? What do I know about this information? Now, working memory is limited, and by limited we mean it has a limited amount of capacity, limited amount of capacity to process. And one of our major goals in instruction is simply this: to reduce the cognitive load. Cognitive load is the amount of information, the volume, if you will, of the information that is in working memory. We want to reduce the cognitive load. So what are some ways that we can reduce the cognitive load? So think about if you were going to cook an onion. If you were going to cook an onion fast, you would cut up the onion. That would allow you to process, air quote, process that onion faster. And this is essentially how the brain works. The brain says, oh my gosh, that's so much information. What can I do to make it so that I can cook up that information or process that information faster? Well, one way that we can do that is to cut the onion up. That is a cognitive load reducer. Here's some other cognitive load reducers. Repeating information. Say this to me. Say repeating information. Repeating information reduces the cognitive load. Imagery reduces the cognitive load. Physical motion reduces the cognitive load. Putting information in our own words reduces the cognitive load. Repetition reduces the cognitive load. All of these elements are cognitive reducers. And that is really what engagement is all about. Engagement is really about this relationship between processing information, filtering information, or perceiving information, processing information through working memory, and then filtering it. So perceiving information, which is sensory memory, what can we do to the information to manipulate it, to orchestrate it so that it's easier to perceive? This diagram is an example of that. I used imagery. I'm using the mouse on the page. Those are things that direct the focus to help us perceive the information. How can we help learners prioritize information? Using this mouse right here is a way to prioritize information. It says, hey, look at this. This is important. An instructor directs the focus continually in an online and in a face-to-face environment. But it's really important in online. We got to constantly direct the focus and prioritize information. And then finally, we help learners process the information. We break it down into chunks. We use repetition. We use symbols. All of these elements that reduce the cognitive load. Now, what working memory does with that information ultimately is working memory takes the information, it processes it, and then through repetition and recall and organization, we package that information and we store it. And then, over time, that information is retrieved. We have to retrieve the information frequently in order to deeply encode it. You've heard the expression, if you don't use it, you lose it. And that expression means that if you do not retrieve the information from memory frequently so that you really strengthen those pathways, then you will lose the information. The brain's very, very efficient. It says it prunes that information away and says, oh, we no longer need that anymore. We don't need to use that information. That's the relationship. Let's review really quickly. We take in information from our sensory memory. That's our perceptions and senses. Our attention, or the reticular activating system, filters and prioritizes that incoming information. Whatever is prioritized is stored in working memory. The goal is to reduce the cognitive load, which means to reduce information so that we can effectively store and process that information. We package this information through repetition and practice. We store that information in long-term memory, and then when we need it, we recall it. This process of encoding and retrieval is how we form long-term memories. But engagement is all about this relationship right here between sensory memory, attention, and working memory. As an instructor, we can manipulate and orchestrate strategies around these factors to make learning more effective.